It was just another routine flight. The early morning fog clung to the ground as the passengers of Flight 302 settled into their seats. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane began its ascent from the runway, climbing higher into the clouds. For the 157 souls aboard, there was no indication that this would be their final journey. Captain Mark Matthews, a seasoned pilot with over 15 years of experience, was at the helm. His co-pilot, Sarah Thompson, sat beside him, reviewing their flight path with practiced calm. Everything appeared normal. The pre-flight checks had been thorough, the aircraft was in excellent condition, and the weather was clear. As the plane soared into the sky, the crew shared a quiet moment of relief. They had flown this route countless times, each one seemingly uneventful. This one, too, would be just like the others, they thought. But then, just minutes into the flight, something changed. The first indication of trouble came when the plane's autopilot system flickered. It was subtle at first, a brief, unexplained dip in altitude that Captain Matthews corrected with a calm hand. It was a minor glitch, a flicker in the system, and nothing to worry about. But then the strange occurrence repeated, this time with more intensity. The aircraft seemed to be fighting against the controls, a force that felt foreign and wrong. Captain Matthews' brow furrowed as he checked the instruments in front of him, Sarah's eyes scanning the same data, trying to make sense of it. They were in a routine climb, miles from the nearest obstacle, but the plane was shaking, jerking ever so slightly, as if something inside wasn't right. Sarah's voice broke through the silence, a calmness in her tone masking the growing concern. "Mark, do you feel that?" He nodded, his grip tightening on the controls. The shaking wasn't just turbulence, it was something deeper, something structural. With his eyes glued to the screens, Mark quickly disengaged the autopilot, taking manual control. As he did, the flight data appeared to stabilize for a brief moment. Just long enough to reassure him that they were back on track. "For now. We'll get this under control," Mark muttered to himself, trying to shake off the creeping feeling in the back of his mind. He glanced over at Sarah, who was silently typing in emergency codes into the system. Something didn't feel right, but they were trained to handle situations like this. Unbeknownst to the passengers, the situation was far more serious than the crew had yet realized. As they climbed higher, the aircraft systems were beginning to fail. One by one, the automated systems started to malfunction. Navigation, altitude, speed all began to fluctuate erratically. The cockpit lights flickered, casting eerie shadows over the crew's faces. Their training was kicking in, but even the best pilots couldn't predict what was coming next. The first officer, Sarah, checked her screen again, her breath catching in her throat. A warning light flashed. The message was clear, stall warning, Mark ... "We've lost the engines," Sarah said, her voice quiet but tinged with panic. The smooth hum of the turbines had turned into a haunting silence, replaced by an eerie sound that grew louder as the altitude dropped. It wasn't a full stall yet, but it was enough to trigger a sense of urgency in the cockpit. Captain Matthews acted quickly, pushing the throttle forward, attempting to regain control. They were too high for a stall, but something was terribly wrong. The descent was happening faster than expected. His hands moved quickly over the controls, but the plane continued to falter, refusing to follow the commands. Sarah's face turned pale as she watched the altitude readings plummet, faster than any normal descent. In the cabin, the passengers were oblivious to the chaos unfolding above them. Some had already drifted into light naps, the hum of the engines lulling them into a sense of comfort. Others were reading or chatting quietly, unaware that in the cockpit, the struggle for control was growing more desperate by the second. Captain Matthews took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. This was the moment every pilot feared, but never truly expected to face. The unknown. The moment when experience couldn't prepare you for what was coming next. As the plane continued its uncontrolled descent, a faint noise echoed through the cockpit, almost like a groaning, cracking sound. It was as though the very airframe was buckling under the pressure. The temperature inside the cabin began to drop, a result of the rapid altitude change, and the warning alarms began to ring out louder than before. Flight 302 had become a living, breathing disaster, its fate sealed in the ominous sounds and flashing lights that filled the cockpit. "Mark, we need to declare an emergency," Sarah said, her voice steady but growing more urgent. But Captain Matthews didn't respond. His eyes were locked onto the instruments, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos. But nothing made sense anymore. Then the worst possible thing happened. The plane jerked violently, the shaking becoming so intense that the crew could barely keep their hands on the controls. The aircraft veered sharply to the left, its wings bending unnaturally. Captain Matthews fought against the wind shear, pushing the throttle forward again, hoping to find some kind of stability, but it was no use. The plane was out of control, and there was nothing left to do but try to ride out the storm. In those final moments, the only sound that could be heard in the cockpit was the rapid beeping of the stall warning, relentless, merciless. The black box, recording everything, captured every horrifying second, as Flight 302 fell through the clouds, spiraling into the unknown. The final transmission from Flight 302 was chilling. The last words spoken before the black box recorded silence were not from the crew. They were from the aircraft itself, a desperate, hopeless sound that would haunt those who listened to it forever. The sound of something breaking. As the plane continued its descent, the passengers below remained unaware of the terror gripping the crew. Their final moments marked by nothing but the illusion of safety, the tranquility of flight until the very end. Flight 302 continued its downward spiral, breaking through the clouds at terrifying speed. Inside the cockpit, time seemed to stretch, each second dragging on longer than the last. Captain Mark Matthews' heart pounded in his chest as he fought to regain control, his hands trembling on the yoke. The stall warning continued its relentless scream, echoing like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable disaster. Sarah Thompson, ever the professional, kept her composure despite the mounting tension. Her eyes flicked between the instruments, her mind racing through emergency procedures. But no procedure, no training, could prepare them for the unknown force pulling their plane into the abyss. The aircraft was no longer responding to the controls. The systems had failed, and the plane had become a passenger in its own tragic descent. "Mark, we're losing it," Sarah muttered, her voice cracking ever so slightly. She had never seen a situation like this in her career. Every instinct told her to brace for impact, but there was no real way to prepare for something so completely out of their hands. The captain nodded, his face pale but determined. "I know, but we have to keep trying." For them, he gestured toward the back of the plane, his mind already thinking of the passengers who were blissfully unaware of the danger. He could only hope that their last moments would be peaceful, that they wouldn't understand the horror unfolding in the cockpit. Outside, the landscape below was swallowed by thick clouds. They were descending into an endless sea of white, the airplane battling against the wind as it fell. In the cabin, the mood was lighter. The majority of the passengers remained unaware, reading magazines or chatting with their neighbors. No one could sense the ever-growing danger, no one except for the flight attendants who had noticed the sudden instability. They exchanged nervous glances, but there was little they could do. In the cockpit, the air felt thick, as if the very atmosphere had become a barrier between them and the world outside. Sarah's fingers flew over the emergency system, trying to communicate with air traffic control. The radio crackled to life, a harsh, distorted voice on the other end. "Flight 302, this is air traffic control. We see your altitude is dropping. Please confirm your situation." Mark's voice, barely a whisper above the deafening alarms, responded, "We have a malfunction, engine failure. We're losing control." The silence on the other end of the radio felt suffocating. Sarah turned to Mark, her eyes wide with fear. "We're too low." "We won't make it to the emergency landing zone." Mark clenched his jaw. His thoughts raced. How had this happened? What went wrong? The nagging question echoed in his mind as they descended deeper into the cloud bank. The plane was no longer a machine, it was a weapon, falling through the sky, its destruction inevitable. The panic had set in, creeping through the walls of professionalism they'd both fought so hard to maintain. In the cabin, one of the flight attendants, Emily, noticed the unease. She had been through enough flights to recognize the signs of a problem, but she still tried to comfort the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts," Her voice was calm, but the underlying tremor didn't go unnoticed by the passengers. Some began to grip their armrests, sensing that this wasn't the usual bumpy ride. The plane shuddered again, violently, and for the first time, a few passengers dared to look out of the windows, their faces drained of color. The steady hum of the engines was replaced with an unsettling silence, punctuated by the mechanical groans of the plane's strained body. Back in the cockpit, the plane's angle had become dangerously steep. They were plummeting, and there was no way to pull out. The black box recorded everything, capturing the desperate, fractured communication between the crew. "We've got 60 seconds before impact," Sarah said, her voice now barely audible, as if the weight of the words alone was too much to bear. Mark's face was set in grim determination as he pushed the throttles forward once more, trying to pull the plane out of its dive. But it was futile. The aircraft was beyond saving. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she heard him. He could see it in her eyes. This was it. The end. Outside, the thick clouds gave way to a brief, fleeting moment of clarity. Through the haze, the faint outline of the ground could be seen, just below them. Trees, hills, perhaps a road. Nothing mattered anymore. The only thing that mattered was survival, and survival was slipping further away with each passing second. Then a strange noise filled the cockpit. A low, grinding hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the plane. Mark's grip tightened on the yoke as the noise crescendoed, now followed by a deep rumbling that seemed to reverberate throughout the entire structure of the aircraft. Something was tearing apart in the bowels of the plane. Some internal component failing under the immense stress of the rapid descent. Sarah, her voice trembling, grabbed the radio once again. "Flight 302, this is urgent, Mayday! Mayday! We're going down!" The desperation in her voice was clear, but there was no response, only static. The communications had failed. They were alone, now wrapped in a freefall, with no time left to save themselves, let alone the people they were sworn to protect. And still, as the minutes passed, the passengers remained unaware. A few screamed out in confusion, wondering why the plane had dropped so suddenly, but it was already too late. Mark's heart thudded in his chest as the black box recorded its final moments, each passing second a step closer to the end. Time had slowed, and as he looked at Sarah one last time, he saw the same grim acceptance reflected in her eyes. Then the rumbling stopped. The plane shook violently and everything went silent. The final, heartbreaking transmission from Flight 302 would forever be etched into the records. We were going down. There was no sound after that final transmission, just the deafening silence that enveloped Flight 302 as it plunged toward the earth. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity, each passing second a fleeting echo of what could have been. The instruments in the cockpit were no longer registering data, the screens black with the loss of power. The only remaining connection to the outside world was the static on the radio, a haunting reminder that help would never come in time. Captain Mark Matthews, though exhausted, still held onto the yoke. His knuckles were white from the strain. His mind, however, was no longer entirely there. His thoughts drifted to his wife, his children, memories of moments now forever lost. He would never get to see their faces again, hear their voices. Sarah Thompson, too, sat frozen beside him, her face pale and drawn. She had done everything she could, and yet it felt like there was nothing more to give. She thought of her mother, her family, and the life she would never lead. The grief was suffocating, but it was impossible to focus on anything other than the stark reality of what was happening. As the plane dropped further, the world outside seemed to distort. The gray clouds broke momentarily, revealing the earth below fields and roads, an innocuous landscape that seemed unaware of the tragedy that was unfolding in the sky. And then, like an inevitability that had been building since the moment they lost control, the ground rushed up to meet them. For the passengers, the minutes had been long, filled with uncertainty. The plane's descent had been erratic, with sudden jolts and sharp turns, but most were still in the dark about the danger they were in. The flight attendants continued their duty, trying to reassure the passengers even as their hearts raced. Emily, one of the attendants, noticed the worry spreading. The calm voices over the intercom seemed like a distant echo, too hollow to convince anyone. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice shaky, Please remain calm. We are experiencing a slight issue with the aircraft. Just remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll get through this." But Emily could hear the panic rising in the passengers' voices, and she could feel it in her chest as well. It was too quiet. The turbulence was no longer an ordinary phenomenon. It was the silence before the storm, the eerie calm before the inevitable. Outside, the clouds parted for a split second. The plane's nose dropped sharply, and it became clear to anyone who was paying attention. This wasn't just turbulence, it was a battle for survival. The passengers were jolted violently in their seats, their seatbelts digging into their bodies as the plane pitched downward. Captain Matthews knew what was coming. His breath came in ragged bursts. His heart ached with the weight of the lives aboard, but the truth was, there was no way out anymore. They were too low, too fast, and the plane was beyond saving. He looked at Sarah one last time, the silence between them deafening. No words needed to be spoken, they both knew. But then, as if in defiance of fate itself, the engines roared back to life for just a moment, a final, fleeting burst of power. Mark seized the opportunity, pushing the throttles to their maximum, praying for even a hint of stability. But it was hopeless. The engines sputtered again, losing their fight against the overwhelming force of gravity, and the plane continued to fall. Then, as quickly as it had come, the noise, the roar of the engines was gone, replaced by the now familiar sound of the wind rushing past the fuselage. The plane, though still in freefall, felt almost like it was being torn apart by the sheer force of its descent. And with it, the last shreds of hope disappeared. In the cabin, chaos erupted. The seatbelt sign blared and people screamed in panic. Some clawed at the walls, some clutched their loved ones, but no one could stop the inevitable. The plane bucked and twisted, sending passengers into each other in a terrifying display of helplessness. Children cried out, unaware of the true danger. Some passengers tried to comfort each other, but there was no comfort to be found. The very air felt suffocating, as if it too was holding its breath. Emily, the flight attendant, tried to hold it together, urging passengers to brace for impact. She had seen enough to know what was coming. It was a slow-motion nightmare, a feeling of helplessness that consumed her from the inside out. She had always been able to keep calm, but this time there was nothing she could do. As the plane continued to plummet, the sound of the descent filled the cabin, the whistling wind outside, the distant rumble of the failing systems, and the ever-growing panic from the passengers. The walls of the plane seemed to creak under the strain. The fabric of reality itself was bending under the weight of impending doom. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it all stopped. The noise, the movement, the chaos. There was a moment of stillness, almost peaceful in its surreal finality. Then came the final crash. The plane collided with the earth in a cataclysmic explosion, the force of the impact sending a shock wave through the surrounding landscape. The sound of metal tearing apart, of glass shattering, was deafening. The ground shook beneath the force of the crash, and for a brief moment the world seemed to freeze in time. Then everything went dark, silence, there was no more radio chatter, no more voices, no more desperation. The black box recorded the final moments of Flight 302. Its terrifying transmissions captured forever in the cold, lifeless depths of the cockpit. The world would never know the full story of what had happened on that flight. What caused the loss of control, what went wrong in those final moments, but the haunting echoes of the crew's last actions would remain forever etched into the memories of those who listened. Emergency teams rushed to the scene, but it was too late. The wreckage was scattered across the fields, the twisted remains of the plane barely recognizable. The rescue teams found no survivors. Flight 302 had become yet another grim reminder of the fragile nature of life, the unpredictability of fate, and the untold stories that would never be fully understood. In the aftermath, the world would search for answers, combing through the black box data and wreckage, trying to piece together the fragments of what happened. But no matter how many questions were asked, no matter how many investigations were launched, there would always be one thing that remained: the eerie silence that followed those final moments. The families of the passengers, the crew, and the world at large would forever carry the weight of this tragedy, haunted by the knowledge that in those final moments they were left with only the echoes of what could have been. Flight 302 would be remembered, not just for the loss of lives, but for the unsolved mystery that lingered in the air long after the wreckage was cleared away.